All right, welcome back to class. This is Introduction to Political Ideas. I'm Ken Hicks. The last couple of lectures or discussions, we've been talking about liberalism, which is an Enlightenment ideology that places individuals and individual rights at the center of all political conversations. The next couple of classes, we're going to be dealing with kind of the alternative, which is conservatism. And that's the view, again, that, and again, it's a very complex set of views, basically arguing that we should have a more organic view of society, that we should be trying to preserve the political institutions and the customs that inform us, that traditions offer us an important source of wisdom and moral knowledge. And that those are things that we abandon at our peril. So we're going to talk first a little bit about what is conservatism. When it becomes it will become obvious pretty quickly that there are a number of different iterations and a number of possible meanings when someone says, I am a conservative. We're going to talk a little bit about the politics of imperfection, about how kind of a fallibilist view of human nature tends to be a dominant theme of most accounts of conservatism. We'll talk about one of the main kind of founding voices of modern conservatism, Edmund Burke. We'll talk a little bit more broadly about conservatism in the 19th century. And we'll conclude with an illustration of a particular variant of conservatism that emerged in the 19th century in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, and how kind of reactionary conservatism dominated European politics, especially in the 19th century. So what exactly is conservatism? At one sense, it's very simple and straightforward. Phonetically, it simply means to preserve what exists. But beyond that, there's little agreement as to the central tenets of what would constitute a distinctively conservative ideology, which is why there's a great deal of factionalization. And oftentimes, conservatism is described as a house with many rooms. Okay, so as a starting point, you can take Abraham Lincoln observing that is not conservatism adherence to the old and tried against the new and untried. So again, at some level, we're talking about conservatism as a disposition, as a tendency to preserve, as a desire to keep things as they are, right? The sense in which, for many people, the impulse, the fear of the unknown tends to outweigh what we do know, right? And an imperfect present is better than an uncertain future. Okay, so can conservatism be reduced to the mere resistance to change? I would argue no. Many conservatives have an aversion to change. But most conservatives, and certainly kind of traditional conservatives, acknowledged that it is the human condition to change as populations expand, as new technologies are introduced. Change occurs whether you like it or not. Most conservatives would simply say that the pace of change should be slow and manageable. And there are some conservatives, and I mentioned reactionary conservatives a little while ago, that are very change friendly, in the sense that they want to go back to some previous idealized time. Okay. In fact, there are ironic implications to embracing that both resistance to change and the preservation of the status quo are central elements of conservatism. If the mere preservation of the status quo or reversion to a previously desired state of affairs is the sole criterion for being conservative, then a hardline Russian Communist Party member of today and a diehard American anti-communist would occupy the same ideological space, albeit in different geographic spots. That seems bizarre, But that's precisely the trouble with attempting to draw these kinds of hard and fast categories of ideological positions, because quite often circumstances, there is always an improvisational aspect to the kinds of ideologies that people form. And to a large extent, the more individuals are in a position to determine what their ideology will be, the more they will adopt kind of chaotic mix and match kinds of attitudes. I mentioned the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the person who killed him last week, and we still are not completely sure of what his motivations were. He was raised within a very conservative household. He was raised in a conservative region. His grandmother said that they didn't even know a Democrat anywhere, that she didn't understand what was going on. Some people have hypothesized that he may have been radicalized at college. Well, he had a full ride scholarship to go to Utah State. He didn't even last a semester. I don't think that a general education, curriculum from a first semester freshman is liable to radicalize him. I think it's far more likely that he was radicalized online. And there again, there are lots of different subcultures that exist online that have that draw pretty promiscuously from a variety of different ideological perspectives. My point being, right now, we just don't know. And that's part of the challenge when we are analyzing ideological positions. Because in some instances, people adopt, for example, there were shell casings that, had certain phrases that are pretty common on the left. They also had symbols that are fairly common in gamer culture. Among certain groups of gamers, especially on those folks that use Discord, which is a chat group software, they pretty much mix and match their ideologies, and there are both far left, alt-right positions that are on Discord, and there are some far left, positions. And so my main point would be, we need more data. We need to understand what was going on with this guy and what caused him to think that killing another human being was somehow a good idea. I can tell you, I think it was ideology that probably did it, but it was also that combination of ideology and online culture. I can't remember the game that it's clear that he was very attached to. But it's pretty clear that there are certain games that involve shooting lots of things that possibly had something to do with this. But again, we don't know. That's why we have trials, and it's unfortunate that we have political leaders that are leaping to conclusions and trying to blame the other side, whatever side you're talking about. I mean, that's kind of a guilt by association game that strikes me as, deeply troubling, inimical to freedom of discourse, and a threat to the First Amendment. So conservatives often, are attracted to the idea, like William F. Buckley, who was a conservative and a major public intellectual in the 20th century. He defined a conservative as someone who stands athwart history yelling, "Stop," at a time when no one is inclined to do so or to have much patience with those who urge it. There is a valorization of conservatism embedded in that kind of definition. He was a proselytizer. He was trying, he was actually doing something similar to what Charlie Kirk was doing, which was attempting to expand, the people who thought like him. So the question again is, what kinds of principles tend to emerge from a disposition to be resistant to change? And the reality is there's a lot of different kinds of positions and principles that will tend to emerge, and we'll be discussing those quite a bit over the course of the next 3 presentations. Conservatism, as I mentioned, it's a house with many rooms. European conservatism emerged again in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars and was largely dedicated to the preservation of the feudal systems of ascribed rights that dominated feudal Europe. In America, conservatism has often been more closely associated with free market capitalism and with the preservation of said capitalism. For Peter Weyrich, who was an American poet and historian who was a leader of the resurgent conservative movement in the 1950s, but who became disenchanted with mid-20th century conservatism, especially with the kind of conservatism espoused by William F. Buckley. He opposed especially McCarthyism as corrupting the ethics of conservatism. And for those of you who don't know, McCarthyism was a period in the 1950s where you had a senator from Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy, who became convinced with very little evidence that there were hundreds of communists in the State Department and elsewhere in government, and launched crusades through his Senate committee chair position until he went after the Army when basically he was shut down. So Peter Weyrich, again, as you kind of dismissively argues, what popularly passes for conservative in America is often only a petrified right-wing, atomistic, laissez-faire liberalism. And so, that, again, is a question of, I oftentimes make the joke that in American politics, ideology spans from welfare liberalism to laissez-faire liberalism. A lot of conservatives don't really appreciate that, but that is sort of where we're at as it relates to, how we view conservatism, because we don't have the kind of social divisions that informed conservatism in Europe. So the politics of imperfection. Again, one of the things that tends to unite conservatives and distinguishes conservatism from libertarianism and from other Enlightenment ideologies is a kind of shared and fairly pessimistic vision of human nature. Conservatives across the spectrum are united in the idea that human beings are and always will be deeply flawed. In other words, humans are neither as intelligent, nor as good, nor as rational as is often assumed by these more perfectionist ideologies. Conservatives simply don't accept that human beings are rational animals. They believe instead that human beings are emotional animals and can oftentimes be driven by passions to do terrible things. And I think that's undoubtedly true. Conservatives generally, and again, the point is not that they have that capacity. From a liberal perspective, the argument would be, yes, they can be driven to irrationality. But nevertheless, they can also be persuaded by appeals to reason. So again, in contrast, a conservative would say that humanity, following Christianity's earliest origins, that humanity is marked by original sin, that the defiance of God is linked to the inability to resist temptation, and for that reason, government exists to try and frankly, control human passions. So again, for most conservatives, the end of government is this idea of confinement, of putting people in their places and keeping them there. For Robert Bork, who was an American jurist who served in the Nixon administration, he said of education, every new generation constitutes a wave of savages who must be civilized by their families, schools, and churches. So from a conservative perspective, attempts to provide people with freedom, which remember, that is one of the main goals of liberalism, it inevitably gives rise to unforeseen and frankly unforeseeable problems that will subsequently have to be cleaned up. In another sense, conservatism constitutes a kind of anti-ideology. When we move on to our discussions of socialism, when you look at some of the programs that liberals have advocated, there is this sense in which people act as social architects. They believe that there is a silver bullet, that there are, if you provide old age help, if you provide medical care, that this will somehow dramatically transform society. Liberals believe that many of these programs, like Social Security and Medicare, have actually done tremendous good. Conservatives express deep skepticism of programs like that are designed to correct the world's ills. And they outright reject the idea of utopian plans and revolutionary appeals that they think, that especially socialists believe will result in a world without sin. So for conservatives, grandiose programs to transform humanity, and not only in failure but in catastrophe. We are much wiser to cherish a peaceful and stable society than to risk its loss in a futile quest for perfection. That is the essence of the conservative perspective. So Edmund Burke is a guy whose extensive writing, and most of his writing, he was an 18th century member of Parliament. He was what we would call a backbencher, but he was widely listened to whenever Whigs were in power. And he is oftentimes viewed as sort of a founder, or certainly an early articulator of a distinctively modern conservatism. And I think we should also note that the conservatism existed in the ancient world. It was largely associated with sort of a pro-government kind of way of looking at things. So as a living figure, Burke was a relatively minor figure. He did not enjoy the kind of socials. He was a lord, but albeit an Irish one. He did not have the kind of social status that would have afforded him access to key positions in Parliament. But he was well respected as a speaker and a writer, and in particular as a defender of key Whig positions. And so his advice was generally well received when his party, he was a Whig, was in power. And it reflects the sense in which partisanship in 18th century England really didn't revolve around ideology in any meaningful sense, because the Tories, of course, were the party of the aristocracy. They were the party of entrenched social order, and the Whigs were the party of the emerging merchant classes. And so again, it reflected this sense in which it's not really ideology is not really emergent in the 18th century to the extent that it is actually influencing people to form really well thought out and coherent, rational kinds of positions. Burke was much more influence over later generations of English and American writers. His most influential writings was a long pamphlet that were published as Reflections on the Revolution in France, written, published in 1790. His critique of the French Revolution really focused on the revolutionaries, the French revolutionaries' assumptions of human nature. And so for the French revolutionaries, the focus was on rights, interests, and choices of individuals that have no connection to one another. In this sense, he's one of the first guys to articulate a critique of liberalism as being atomistic in nature. And what do we mean by atomistic? It means that when we view people as self-interested and self-interested people, it becomes really difficult to imagine those people coming together for any kind of common cause. And so Burke basically is offering a reflection of society that emphasizes the organic nature of society, in which, again, society, government is like a human, like a living organism. And so simply chopping up or lopping off parts of a government to Burke is a deeply irresponsible act that ignores the decades of context in which a particular program or a government agency emerged. And so Burke was likewise deeply critical of the liberal reliance on social contract theory because he didn't think that people were in a position to form sound contracts. And so in contrast, Burke argues that society is based on a sacred covenant, something much deeper and more closely, more deeply intertwined with, deeply rooted customs and long-standing political and moral traditions. So government is not a machine to be tinkered with, but a complex and delicate organism rooted in custom and traditions. So Burke held that both government and society, long-standing customs and traditions are indispensable because they provide meaning to people. And without that meaning, it's difficult for people to make sense of the world around them. Conservatives like Burke had a distinctive view of freedom as well. Asking if freedom is a good thing is like asking if fire is a good thing. If controlled, fire is a useful tool. However, when the destructive power of mobs, untethered from law, tradition, and custom, are unleashed, they can work real mischief in society. It's a terrifying thing for people like Burke, because they were right across the pond, they were right across the English Channel, watching what was going on. So for Burke, before we risk congratulating ourselves on giving individuals the right to choose, we really need to be aware of what it is that they might choose. So for Burke, a lot of work has to be done before you give people choice. So conservatives like Burke view liberty as desirable when individual liberty does not threaten to upset the social order. Where many early liberals viewed government as a necessary evil, Burke and his fellow conservatives view government as essential to the constraint on the unlicensed liberties of individuals that can lead again to lawlessness. So for Burke, liberty must be limited in order to be possessed. So given conservatives' dismal view of human nature, Burke viewed the absence of government as contributing to mob rule. That would be the inevitable result for somebody like Edmund Burke. So for a classical conservative like Burke, freedom is something like this. The agent is a set of interconnected individuals. The obstacles are radicalism, radical ideas, innovation, passions, desires, lack of restraint, irresponsibility, etc., etc. The goal for a conservative is order, stability, harmony, knowing your place, if you will, continuity. These are the things that are the ends. This is what freedom means to a conservative. Burke had some distinctive ideas about revolution. Of course, as any Englishman, he understood the history of, English acquaintance with revolution. And so, to paraphrase Barack Obama, Burke was not opposed to all revolutions, just the dumb ones. In other words, he accepted that change in human events is inevitable, but it should be managed and incremental. While innovation was based on, while innovation is based on radical theories, reform is founded on what he characterized as prejudice. And so for Burke and many conservatives, prejudice is not a negative thing, but it is rather the disposition to prefer the familiar habits and traditions of one's own society to the unknown. Okay? And so again, how does this reflect his view of revolution? He was supportive, in fact, of the American Revolution. He was actually an advocate for peace prior to the American Revolution, and he advocated for a quick secession of hostilities because ultimately he believed that the crown was on the wrong side of the issue. At the same time, he became one of the most trenchant critics of the French Revolution. And again, it gets back to the basic distinction between the American and the French revolutions. As I mentioned in an earlier presentation, the American Revolution was a political revolution. It basically displaced the British Crown as the seat of sovereign authority and replaced it with colonial governments that became the Articles of Confederation and subsequently were revised into the new Constitution. So Burke was fairly ecumenical as it related to government. He didn't believe that there was any one best form of government, but his speech, his speeches and his writings suggest that certain features of government were more likely to lead to stable, effective, and accountable government. Among those features, there are three that are discussed. One would be representative government. So it's not a surprise that Burke, the legislator, supported representative government. But he embraced a rather broad notion of representation in his famous speech to the electors of Bristol that was written in 1774. And to his view of representatives, he basically said, "I owe you my talents, I do not owe you slavish devotion. I should not be running around with my finger up in the air trying to figure out what it is that my constituents want. You elected me because you trusted my talents and my ability." So for Burke, your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment, and he betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion. Because he's more important to have he or she these days is far more likely to have a better appreciation of what is best for the common good in the long run rather than some specific good outcome. Another feature which we'll address in a little bit more detail later on in this presentation is the idea of a true natural aristocracy. Burke believed that there were relatively few people in society that have the ability, experience, and inclination to govern wisely. He made a distinction between the hereditary aristocracy and Burke's true natural aristocracy. They're not synonymous. He did argue that most governing elites would come from that hereditary aristocratic party because they had the leisure time, they had the access to educational, they had the access to the kinds of political experience that make you a better political actor. So despite the fact that he draws this distinction, he recognized there were plenty of useless aristocrats in the British upper social set. But he was absolutely horrified by the French Revolution's direct assault on aristocratic privilege. And again, he viewed that as, the revolutionaries uprooting the basic, elements of French society in the search for some ideal, new society. Another feature of Burke's kind of belief system is the idea of private property. Private property provides the stabilizing and conservatizing force in society. Property owners have a preference for economic and political stability. Land inheritance was a particularly important idea in an inspiring attachment, in inspiring patriotism. In America, the Jeffersonian and Madisonian view of democracy emphasized the value of agriculture and civic virtue of rural farmers. This is a kind of American early 19th century manifestation of a kind of Burkean claim, which again is the idea that owning land, working the soil, is an important aspect of citizenship. Another feature is this idea of little platoons. Okay, Burke supported effective government, but he also believed that governmental power and authority should not be unduly concentrated in any one institution. Burke, like most conservatives, feared that concentrated power would create the temptation to abuse authority. This was one of the things that a lot of folks hoped would happen with Trump in his second term, that conservative Republicans would begin to recognize that Trump, assuming all this power unto himself, would threaten the constitutional order. That simply has not taken place. So instead, he supported the idea of the dispersal of power within civil society to these little platoons, which he described as the nuclear family, churches, local community groups. All of these go a long way towards creating an environment in which, again, people have a sense of their own power and authority by working within those little platoons. So what is Burke's legacy? A lot of contemporary conservatives self-identify as Burkean. Many contemporary conservatives have made peace with representative democracy, if not all of them have made peace with democracy itself. Many espouse Burke's notions of a true natural aristocracy and argue, that America's wealthy classes produce plenty of, prep school educated kids that can go to an Ivy League, and that puts them in a position to rule. Conservatives generally defend the importance of private property and fear the concentration of power in the hands of the state by reinforcing the importance of civil society. And again, this just goes back to the idea of these little platoons. So let's look at some of his kind of primary writings. These are selections from, again, Reflections on the Revolution in France, and then a letter he wrote, which is titled An Appeal from the New to the Old Whigs. Burke basically begins with an argument that government is not a product of natural rights, which is kind of an oblique criticism of social contract theory. Burke did not overtly reject social contract theory, but he had a broader understanding of the nature of the contract, viewing it as a kind of an ordained agreement between the living, the dead, and future generations. So government is rather a contrivance of human wisdom. It is a contrivance to provide for human wants. And here Burke is employing an arcane usage of want, which is, this definition, the sense in which it's not referring to entitlements, but rather to deficiencies that people are lacking. So skillful government, according to Burke, requires a deep understanding of human nature and of human necessity. And so Burke is, evincing a kind of hostility to natural rights. There's no simple direct disposition or direction of power can work to adequately govern human affairs. The simple governments are fundamentally defective, to say no worse of them. The pretended rights of the prophets of the French Revolution are posed in uncompromising terms, which means they don't really know what they're talking about. The possibility of metaphysical propositions being true in theory but politically false, again cautions and presents this idea that we should be careful what we're trying to achieve. There's a quotation at the bottom: men have no right to what is not reasonable and to what is not for their benefit. The fact that you are then putting government in a position to determine what is to a person's benefit is, I would argue, potentially at least, kind of troubling. So Burke argues that people should be judged by the whole of their feelings. We have real hearts of flesh. In this unenlightened age, I am bold enough to confess that we are generally men of untaught feelings. Humans cherish their prejudices because they are our prejudices. Burke views prejudice as a kind of received wisdom. And so for Burke, religion is necessary. You have to have religion to instill a wholesome awe upon free citizens. He makes an argument about sovereignty. He believes, the regime founded on popular sovereignty is superior to one founded by a single prince. Why? Princes have no authority. In the absence of people loyal to their person to enforce their will, they really have no power. Princes will fall prey to flattery and may fall into dictatorial ways and are vulnerable to being overthrown or killed by their own security forces. This is not him necessarily pointing. There's a lot of examples. The only thing worse is perfect democracy, which Burke found to be the most shameless thing in the world and the most fearless. The people at large become capricious and tyrannical of themselves. He goes on to note that like the flies of summer in a pure democracy, the people become a licentious mob. It is a mob imbued with a conviction of natural rights and rejects any restraint. Eventually, the mob sweeps away all magistrates, civil, ecclesiastical, or military. By this unprincipled facility of changing the state so often, and as much, and in as many ways as there are floating fancies of fashions, the whole chain and continuity of the Commonwealth would be broken. No generation could link with the others. So again, this is a sense in which he draws on a metaphor too. He talks about a house, and if you're going to repair the house, you don't necessarily want to just tear it down to the foundation. And you have to have the right tools. And for Burke, the French revolutionaries simply didn't have the right tools because they weren't drawing on the right materials. So he argues society is, in fact, a contract. Society needs government to avoid the evils of inconstancy and versatility. The state is consecrated in such a way that individuals avoid criticizing, but with due caution. The social contract that forms the state is different from a mercantile contract. It is to be looked upon with reverence because it is not a partnership in things subservient only to the gross animal existence of a temporary and perishable nature. Rather, it is a durable contract that's designed to preserve across generations. So another illustration of his writings is the appeal from the new to the old Whigs. And this is actually an example. The Whigs were kind of split over the French Revolution, and he was trying to kind of heal that rift within the Whig Party. And all of this is happening while he is basically suffering from stomach cancer. So you need leadership. Effective leadership is required to enable men to act with the weight and character of a people. A well-led society enables the wiser, more expert to enlighten those less wise, less expert, and less well provided. When the multitude are under this discipline, they can scarcely be said, when the multitude are not under this discipline, they can scarcely be said to be in a civil society. What do you think Burke would say about our situation today? I mean, certainly I think he would look at someone like Donald Trump and say, well, he's well born, he's from a wealthy family, he was raised, he went to prep school, he has certain skills, but is he enlightening people? Is he leading people away from the breakdown of basic civil norms? Or is he rather exploiting our divisions for his personal gain? Is that something that, that a Burkean conservative would look at and say, yeah, okay, that's okay, I can see that. Again, he gets back to this idea of a true natural aristocracy. Genuine nobility is not a separate interest in the state nor separable from it. It is an essential integrant part of any large body rightly constituted. There are many habits that render the nobility fit for leadership. And this is a long passage that I want to read that kind of gives you a sense of how the true natural aristocracy may not be defined entirely by the hereditary nobility, but it's almost entirely drawn from it. Here it is. To be bred in a place of estimation, to see nothing low and sordid from one's infancy, to be taught to respect oneself, to be habituated to the sensorial inspection of the public eye, to look early to public opinion, to stand upon such elevated ground as to be enabled to take a large view of the widespread and infinitely diversified combinations of men in a large society. To have the leisure to read, to reflect, to converse, to be enabled to draw the court and attention of the wise and the learned wherever they may be found, to be habituated in armies to command and to obey, to be taught to despise danger in the pursuit of honor and duty, to be formed to the greatest degree of vigilance, foresight, and circumspection, in a state of things in which no fault is committed with impunity and the slightest mistakes draw the most ruinous consequences, to be led to a guarded and regulated conduct, from a sense that you are considered as an instructor of your fellow citizens in their highest concerns, and that you act as a reconciler between God and man, to be employed as an administrator of law and justice, and to be thereby amongst the first benefactors of mankind, to be a professor of high science or of liberal and ingenuous art, to be amongst rich traders who from their success are presumed to possess the virtues of diligence, order, constancy, and regularity, and to have cultivated an habitual regard to communicative justice. These are the circumstances of men that form what we should call a natural aristocracy, without which there is no nation. So Burke declared that the state of nature generates this true natural aristocracy as the soul to the body without which man does not exist. And again, he is saying that these institutions, like a true natural aristocracy and the hereditary aristocracy from which they come, are part of an organic view of society, and that to hew those institutions from that organic body is to do it inordinate harm. All right, let's talk more generally about conservatism in the 19th century. Burke was an 18th century figure. He died in the 1790s. The 19th century was, again, a very different age. The 18th century remained, it was modern, but it was not industrial. So it's a distinctive kind of age. And remember, England is going through the Industrial Revolution kind of at the cusp of the Napoleonic Wars. And the Napoleonic era is an absolutely explosion of change in European politics. Remember, Napoleon emerged out of revolutionary France, became, a sort of dictator unto himself. He crowned himself as Emperor of France. He conquered many of the countries of Europe and named people close to him as their kings. He commanded enormous armies, and again, the transformative. We oftentimes hear this phrase, transformation in military, or revolution in military affairs. The revolution in military affairs that occurred during the Napoleonic era was the levée en masse. The fact that Napoleon could draw huge numbers of Frenchmen and other people to serve in his armies gave him an enormous advantage. As I think I mentioned in a previous presentation, Voltaire's ironic quote, "God favors the big battalions." That a larger army, well led, will almost always prevail over a smaller military force. And so the Napoleonic era really sweeps away, at least briefly, many of the remaining vestiges of feudalism. And just as rapidly, reactionary forces within the Congress of Vienna attempted to reestablish the pre-Napoleonic status quo. And that gave rise to an enormous amount of frustration and ultimately to economic difficulties in Europe. And resistance to the politics of reaction gave rise to different interpretations of conservatism, but it also gave rise to distinctively new radical ideologies. One of the main kind of architects of reaction was Clemens von Metternich, who was an Austrian, a Habsburg statesman. He was an advocate of throne and altar ideology, dedicated to preserving both the hereditary monarchies of Europe, but also to preserving the secular influence of the Catholic Church. He helped within the Congress of Vienna to construct. He was instrumental in constructing what became known as the Austrian system of diplomacy, which kept Germany and Italy politically fragmented until well into the 19th century. Again, along with the Duke of Wellington, he was an influential voice at the Congress of Vienna. And he was ultimately forced from power due to the revolutions of 1848. Now, the revolutions of 1848 was a set of revolutions and political upheaval that took place in over 50 countries in Europe and elsewhere. It began in Italy. They spread to France and into the Habsburg Empire of Austria and into the German principalities. There were multiple causes, but much of it was attributable to dissatisfaction with the authoritarianism of the European system established under the Congress of Vienna, but also to widespread economic pain and the emergence of nationalist sentiments, both in Germany and in Italy. It's important to keep in mind that the Catholic Church was a deeply reactionary institution, really from the 19th century well into the 20th century. I would argue, in fact, that there have been attempts to reestablish the more reactionary impulses of the Catholic Church under Benedict. The Church, had found itself in the early modern era confronting a great deal of criticism. Its position in secular politics was increasingly becoming contested. The Catholic Church took a decidedly reactionary turn following the revolutions of 1848 and launched a counterattack on liberal criticisms of religious dogma. The primary target of the Catholic Church in the latter part of the 19th century was the formation of a Protestant-dominated German state in 1871. Which came as a direct blow to the Catholic Church's sponsorship of the Catholic majority states of France and the Austrian, Hungarian, the Austrian Habsburg Empire. Part of this kind of counterattack was Pope Pius IX's syllabus of errors. To quote a couple of them, error number 3, human reason, without any regard to God, is the sole arbiter of truth and falsehood, of good and evil. It is a law unto itself, and by its natural force it suffices to secure the welfare of men and nations. That he viewed as an error. Error number 77, in the present day, it is no longer expedient that the Catholic religion shall be held as the only religion of the state to the exclusion of all other modes of worship. The syllabus of errors is issued in reaction to the German state's increasing aggressiveness in seizing ecumenical lands and posts in Catholic-dominated portions of the German principalities that became part of the German state. Remember, Germany unified under the leadership of Prussia, and Prussia was Protestant-dominated. Almost 1/3 of the population of what became a unified Germany in 1871 were Catholic. And so the result was like a 14-year-long kind of culture war, which the Germans described in their inimicable language as the Kulturkampf, which is, again, culture struggle or culture combat. And it lasted basically the remainder of Pius IX's term. And when he died, he was replaced by a more modern, oriented pope who sought to lead the Catholic Church in a more moderate direction. And so in one sense, we're going to talk a little bit about the politics of reaction. What does it mean to be a reactionary? In one sense, all politics is reactive. That is to say, events happen and we respond to them. What makes someone reactionary is not the fact that they are reacting to political reality in a certain way, but it is rather the determination to reverse history and to go back to some earlier, simpler historical timeline. So what distinguishes reactionaries from other conservatives is often their radicalism in seeking change. The willingness to engage in revolutionary means to achieve the goal of overthrowing the president and returning to some kind of idealized past is what characterizes a great deal of conservative thought. And I would make the argument that in the 20th century, the Republican Party really moved in a reactionary direction over the course of the 1960s. What was the nature of the reaction? They were reacting against the New Deal. They wanted to go back to a time when laissez-faire liberalism and laissez-faire capitalism was basically the norm of the American way of life. Remember Calvin Coolidge's famous commentary, "The business of America is business," which reflected the sense in which American government was in the business of allowing, business to do its business, which is incredibly tautological, but nevertheless, that's what what informed them. It was also this sense in which you want to unwind the New Deal, get rid of all these New Deal programs. Also, among the newly formed, a new element of the Republican coalition were former Democrats from southern states. These were racial conservatives that wanted to basically unwind the civil rights movement, and they wanted to unwind many of the civil rights laws. You see contemporary conservatives saying things like that. Charlie Kirk, for example, said that he thought the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a mistake. He's not the only conservative to do that. I am not criticizing him per se. I am locating him as a kind of reactionary conservative who wanted to go back in time to some previous era. Donald Trump himself has made the argument that the United States was at its apogee as a civilization in 1897. Ask yourself what was good about America in 1897, and that's what Donald Trump wants to try and recreate. Whether he has the means to do so or not is again an open question. So these are the kind of, again, this is one kind of manifestation of conservatism, this sense in which there is a nostalgia for some previous time, right? How do we get back in time how do we rewind, if you will? And of course, the problem is that as circumstances change, it becomes harder and harder to figure out a way to reverse course and tread back down the pathway, if you will. So one of the key and one of the most articulate kind of figures of the reactionary politics of the 19th century was a Savoyard diplomat and writer and philosopher by the name of Joseph de Maistre. And he described him, basically he believed that conservatism was, in fact, reaction. He was oftentimes described as a furious theocrat. His view of human nature is pretty clear. Man is insatiable for power. He is infantile in his desires and always discontented with what he has, loves only what he has not. People complain of the despotism of princes. They ought to complain of the despotism of man. So he was vehement in his denunciations of the French Revolution's overthrow of the throne and altar. He rejected outright the notion that people were capable of drafting and living under a constitution. He basically made the argument, the more that is written, the weaker is the institution. The reason being clear. Laws are only declarations of rights, and rights are not declared except when they are attacked. So that the multiplicity of written constitutional laws shows only the multiplicity of conflicts and the danger of destruction. And you ask yourself, well, if there are not constitutional laws, then how are people to behave? And for him, they are simply to behave as a king tells them, or as the monarch tells them to act. So he was a key figure and he was one of the founding members, one of the first people to become sort of a trenchant, criticizer of the Enlightenment. And so in many ways, he appeared to be hostile to modernity itself. He spent a great deal of his time in the early 19th century in the court of the Russian czars as the Savoyard. Remember, there were a lot of different kind of smaller countries that have now become part of France, for example, near Switzerland. He was, a diplomat. He was known as a brilliant conversationalist. People enjoyed his company. At the same time, he was one of those people that kind of originated the idea of being delightful and yet saying awful things. As one Russian, kind of person who had encountered him would write of Joseph de Maistre, that he's so much fun to talk to, but he writes as if from the scaffold. In other words, as if he's writing from the place where you execute people, because he believed so fervently that human nature is so fallen that only the absolute threat of death can keep people controlled. And so that justified in his light a kind of political regime in which rulers are completely unrestrained in their powers over their populations. Regarding the French Revolution, he rejected the idea of universalism, the idea that there is this universal humanity that deserves equal respect under the law. He would write, "In my lifetime, I have seen Frenchmen, Italians, Russians, etc. But I swear I have never ever encountered man. If he exists, I have missed him." And again, what is that suggesting? It's suggesting a kind of deep sense in which people are really only respected as bearers of a language and a history and a culture. Otherwise, they are simply abstractions that cannot be meaningfully understood. Again, he writes, constitutions are a pure abstraction, an academic exercise for the mind, modeled after some imaginary hypothesis. And in one sense, he is absolutely correct. Right? Constitutions are simply words on a page if people with political authority are not prepared to be bound by those constraints. That's really what constitutions are. They are a limitation on the power of people in certain public offices. And people who don't respect the law and ultimately don't respect the Constitution are, frankly, again, they prove that sense in which, Joseph de Maistre was just saying, it's just words on a page. Constitutions, in his view, based on universal principles, ignore customs and traditions. Customs like a hereditary nobility, an absolute monarch, possibly slavery, possibly the denial of women's, basic rights. These are the customs that someone like Joseph de Maistre says we cannot question under any circumstances. De Maistre was unsparing in his contempt for the idea of popular sovereignty. He is probably one of the last figures to make the argument for divine right. The government of a nation is no more its own creation than its language. And again, he's getting to a very, tight point here. What leads to the creation of language? Language at some level emerges just as a mode of communication. How does it work? How do we teach language? If you think about it, part of the reason why all Frenchmen speak a legible form of French is that the French state made them. The French state, undertook an effort. What Jean-Jacques Rousseau would say, they held people's noses together and taught them how to write, taught them how to read and write French that everyone could understand. So he basically, de Maistre is, and he was no friend of Rousseau, as we'll if you read more about him. The nation's founder is its helping hand. He is never to be seen writing or debating. His manner of proceeding comes from inspiration, and if he sometimes takes pen in hand, it is not to debate, but to issue commands. This is the sense in which, again, kings cannot be bothered with rules. So de Maistre rejects the idea that a constitution can be created, much as a watchmaker manufactures a watch. Men never respect what they themselves have created, which is why an elected ruler never possesses the moral force of a hereditary sovereign, since he is not as noble. Here again, de Maistre demonstrates his conviction that popular sovereignty lacks weight precisely because it lacks the kind of grandeur that is independent of men and comes only through the work of time. And again, he's using the masculine in part, he's a product of his time. But in part, it's because if you bring Joseph de Maistre into the present, he would be no respecter of the rights or the intellects of women. Like Burke, de Maistre draws upon the idea of an organic view of society. In this, he uses a different kind of metaphor. He talks about the idea of a national soul, right? And that is again informed by the notion of these useful prejudices. Individuals following their own reason inevitably leads to anarchy. For de Maistre, patriotism is an ineluctable part of this national soul, and it consists of individual self-denial. The true patriot knows only two words: surrender and belief. He's drawing on an idea where he's combining patriotism with hereditary monarchy, which did not exist when hereditary monarchs were dominant. Remember, they didn't keep large armies in the early modern era because kings couldn't rely on patriotism. Patriotism is precisely that product of the nationalist sentiment that de Maistre is criticizing. Okay? But he's basically saying, hey, now we have it, we're going to use it, right? And it forms the component part of this national soul. And so for de Maistre, there is, in one important sense, reason is good for nothing. The problem with theory is that it is born, lives, withers, and drops like leaves from a tree. Human morality is bequeathed by ancestors as useful prejudices or dogmas, but we owe nothing to anyone's individual reason. And again, you're getting back to this sense in which there is no point in criticizing those things that have been received from us, from our ancestors. These prejudices cannot be criticized by any individual. Think about some of the great literature of the Elizabethan era. Think about Shakespeare. Think about Romeo and Juliet. What was it that was the driver of that play? It was love between two warring factions, right? And the sense in which, to a sense, it was a paean to romantic love, right? Which can spring up, spontaneously because of two individuals. In a world created by Joseph de Maistre, there would be only arranged marriages. Individual love would be scorned because it was not really particularly useful. This is Joseph de Maistre's view of, again, when you have this dim a view of human nature, individual agency falls by the wayside very quickly. De Maistre has no use for it. And so for him, the seat of all political authority and sovereignty, the authority of government rests with monarchy. Men are born for monarchy, according to Joseph de Maistre. Again, he offers a defense of divine right and basically says the rejection of divine right amounts to the rejection of God. Men must always know about history, which is the one and only teacher in politics. But it's always going to be a particular kind of history. It will be the history written by monarchs. A hagiography of the rule of their family. And again, this is informed by his view of human nature. Man is hungry for power, forever unhappy with what he already has, and loves only what he does not have. Then, the grass is always greener, right? God established monarchy as a restraint on human ambition in the form of monarchy. He dismisses the idea of popular assemblies and basically says, the people always begin by being in the right and always end by being in the wrong. He has no use for the idea that many heads are better than one. He turns Machiavelli's idea about what's wrong with princely rule on its head. The king is always right. Why? Because the king is all powerful. The king is the determiner of right and wrong. And so here we are, to this point we've gotten to about the middle of the 19th century. And these are some of the critical ideas of conservatism. You have, again, this notion in which human nature, people are fallen. It flows from certain, just about all Christian, Christian traditions. The story of Adam and Eve, right? Because of that, the end of government primarily is fundamentally driven by a need to restrain. And importantly, freedom in this sense is And this is one where we're going to see that the idea of freedom is tightly bound up. It's not individual freedom. You're not just free for your own sake. You're not free to revise your own views. There has to be some sense of the good of your moral tradition that is informing your beliefs. Within a conservative perspective, this is the idea that, if you're born into a family of doctors, you should become a doctor. It is the sense in which the well-trodden path is the most reliable one. As we move forward in our discussion of conservatism, as we get into the 20th century, we begin to see that there are more and more different interpretations of conservatism and what conservatism can mean as a distinctively ideological position. But what it often means is, again, this sense in which people can't be trusted, and you have to have certain kinds of constraint on how people are supposed to act. So we'll get into more of conservatism in our next presentation. I'll see you next time.